Hello everybody, this is Jörg once again from YouTube channel Joggler66, and today I'm gonna reading, what kind of English is that? Jörg, get it together. I'm gonna read chapter 19 of Rulers of Evil. Yesterday I read to you the chart of Lorenzo Ricci's general rate between 1750 and 1775. When he so-called died, and we read in chapter 19 that is titled The Death and Resurrection of Lorenzo Ricci. As I told you already before, he probably faked his death, and H.Tupper Saussy will now go into that part that I'll be reading to you right now. The author starts, on November 19th, 1775, officials at Castel Sant'Angelo were presented the following deposition, giving under oath and signed by Lorenzo Ricci. By the way, what do you think an oath meant to the general superior? Huh? An oath to whom? Huh? Okay, the deposition reads as follows, quote, "The Society of Jesus that is dissolved offered no reason or pretext whatsoever for its dissolution." Unquote. This, Ricci's last official statement, is a masterpiece of mental reservation, for indeed the Society had not offered a pretext or reason for its dissolution, and indeed Lorenzo Ricci had not furnished a pretext or reason for his incarceration. The Jesuits had been dissolved and Ricci imprisoned for no offered reasons whatsoever. Ergo, their dissolution for all eternity was null and void. Outcome would prove this fact. The Society of Jesus would be officially restored in 1814. Now, I have to comment a little bit on this. In other words, I am convinced, not the author, I, Jörg, am convinced, that the whole quote-unquote agenda to quote-unquote officially ban the Jesuits was just a decoy. Princes, kings and emperors were pushed to ban the Jesuits in the first place, and after Pope Clement XIV quote-unquote banned the Jesuits, the whole world thought they were safe now. What a wonderful scheme, don't you think? Now the society could really start going secular, occupying secular professions without being suspected of actually being a Jesuit. The same reason Jesuit-trained Adam Weishaupt founded the Illuminati, another front organization for the quote-unquote suppressed Jesuits to hide behind. Do you know what the problem with most people is when they read or hear things like that? To do evil, you must be evil yourself. When you are not evil, you cannot understand the motivation for these people, why they do it, what they do, and how they do it. And that is why most people, when confronted with evil things like all the things Jesuits stand for, they talk to you back of quote-unquote conspiracy theory, fables, made-up stories, fiction, rumors, etc. That is only for their own conscience, because they cannot comprehend that these things really happen. They just cannot comprehend it, because in their heart they cannot identify with evil. So they oppress it, close their ears, close their eyes, and by their ignorance tell themselves, it's not happening. You know the funny picture of the three apes? The one closing his mouth, the other one closing his ears, and the third one closing his eyes? That's how most people react when they are confronted with evil so bad. They cannot grasp it because they don't have this evil mind to even try to understand this. So when they cannot comprehend it because in their heart they cannot identify with evil, they oppress it, they close their ears and eyes, and by ignorance tell themselves it's not happening. Because if it were true, they would lose all hope in life. Now, here is where Jesus comes in. Because we Bible-believing Christians, we know we have Jesus, the way, the truth, and the life on our side. We open our ears and eyes to the evil of the world and recognize this for what it really is. The kingdom of Satan on earth, exposed. And that is what we do. We expose the kingdom of Satan for what it is, the world for what it really is. Because we already are told in the Bible not to have fellowship with evil, but rather to expose it. And that's what we do. Closing our eyes and doing ignorantly as if it all doesn't happen does only further the agenda of the devil and does not help us in any way. It only makes us fearful, and that's what they want. They want to induce fear into us. And just comes into my mind a few days ago, Greg Anthony on First Amendment Radio aired 2 hours of an interview with H.Tupper Saussy, the author of this book. He did in 2006 after years of these files had been lost. An attentive listener who saved them on his PC sent them to him and he could publish them again. And it would really be nice if you go there and listen to Greg Anthony's investigative journal on First Amendment Radio, or the YouTube channel of First Amendment Radio. You can go also and listen to the broadcast on the 5th and 6th, I think. It was the 5th and the 6th of November. Very fittingly, yeah, the 5th of November, the gunpowder plot, and he finds this and can bring the lost interview of H.Tupper Saussy back to reality. And there you will see what H.Tupper Saussy had to say about this, and he says about the same thing that I'm saying here, about the fear that is introduced into people because they just cannot get it. But we have to go back to the book here, and the point is that the outcome proves that fact, that the Society of Jesus would be officially restored in 1814. Now, many people say that that is a sign that from that moment on the Jesuits were absolutely controlling the papacy, the white papacy. But I tell you that when you really dig into it and when you have really understood what I have read all this time in Rulers of Evil, then you know that the Society of Jesus had a very, very strong grip on the papacy already from before 1814. And that this whole dissolution, this whole banishment of the Jesuits was just a show. Okay, the Pope died because of that show, but he had to play his role. And that to me is a sign that the Jesuits already were before in control. But they needed this to get behind other front organizations like the Illuminati, founded by Adam Weishaupt, who taught Roman Catholic canon law at the Jesuit University of Ingolstadt in Bavaria, and founded the Illuminati as another front organization for the so-called suppressed Jesuits, and that all these Jesuits now could go into all the secular jobs they wanted to do, like lawyers and printers and architects and I don't know, wherever they could be, and they would not be suspected of being a Jesuit because, hey, the Jesuits don't exist anymore. Yeah, that was really a wonderful idea. Make the Jesuits non-existent, and from the back they do everything so important. And the same thing comes back in the papacy a little bit later on, when we go to Pope, Pope Pius IX, right? The longest reigning Pope that I spoke about last time, or that I spoke about also in Babylon Mystery Religion Part 3, if you missed that. It's not online yet, but or maybe it's online after this one, I don't know. I got it on my computer. Check it out. Speaking about Pope Pius IX, the one with his syllabus of errors, and the one busy during Vatican Council I in 1870 and the loss of the Papal States, and what did the papacy all do in the time between 1870 when they lost the Papal States and the time the wound was beginning to heal again in 1929 with the signing of the Lateran Treaty? Yeah. They had, for example, the infallibility of the Pope, just to name one thing. Well, they could do that because, hey, the papacy was dead, right? The Pope lost it all, right? That's what they sold ya. That's not what happened, but that's what they sold ya. Okay, I'm gonna continue reading now on page 187, on the bottom of the page. Since this establishment was a nullity from the beginning, it must follow that the Jesuits were still technically alive as the world's largest clandestine Milice du Christ, means militia of Christ. That's French. Legally, thousands of Jesuits were still bound to their oath of obedience to the Black Papacy. They were free now to expand Roman Catholicism with perfect invisibility and justifying means, dedicating their encyclopedic skills in the useful arts, law, religion, medicine, philosophy, the humanities, finance, commerce, communications, diplomacy, banking, finance, espionage, and intrigue, dedicating all to both sides of the self-extirpating Protestant belligerents. Quote, now, whether he kill Cassio or Cassio him, or each to kill the other, every way makes my gain. Unquote. If the Society of Jesus could conquer, though believe dead, could not its superior general do the same? When Lorenzo Ricci died in his cell at Castel Sant'Angelo on November 24, 1775, what if his quote-unquote death was no more physical than the supposed disestablishment of his army? Lesser mystics than Ricci, who secretly commanded the Rosicrucians, were known to die and resurrect at the threshold of important endeavors. Quote, according to material available, the Supreme Council of the Fraternity of the Rose-Croix, meaning the Rosicrucians, was composed of a certain number of individuals who had died what is known as quote-unquote the philosophic death. When the time came for an initiate to enter upon his labors for the order, he conveniently quote-unquote died under somewhat mysterious circumstances. In reality, he changed his name and place of residence, and a box of rugs or a body secured for the purpose was buried in his stead. It is believed that this happened in the case of Sir Francis Bacon, who, like all servants of the mysteries, renounced all personal credit and permitted others to be considered as the authors of the documents which he wrote or inspired. Was it really Ricci's body lying in state at the Cathedral of San Giovanni di Fiorentini during the elaborate funeral mass that Pius VI arranged for him? Was it really Lorenzo Ricci who was entombed beneath the Church of the Jesuits a week later, in the vault reserved for generals of the society? Or was it a wax effigy sculptured by artisans upon a corpse of Ricci's dimensions, under the direction of John Carroll's collaborator, man about Rome and art agent extraordinaire, Francis Thorpe, who you remember from a few chapters before? Of course, Lorenzo Ricci would have covered his tracks in sublimely Sun Tzuan fashion. So we can never be sure. But is it not consistent with his authority, his resources, his motives and modus operandi, as well as the verifiable outcome of American independence, that the general who would feign death at precisely this opportunity and sail to America in order to conduct his orchestrations personally? Reflect on his counsel in the 13 Articles of Sun Tzu, particularly, quote, "The great art of a general is to arrange for the enemy never to know the place where he will have to fight, and to careful withhold from him knowledge of which posts he must guard. If he manages that, and can also hide the slightest of his movements, then he is not only a clever general, he is an extraordinary man, a prodigy. Without being seen, he sees. He hears without being heard. Go to places where the enemy would never suspect that you intended to go. Do not think of gathering the fruits of your victory until his entire defeat has put you in a position where you can yourself reconnoiter, means scout, surely, tranquilly and with leisure. If the general did, unquote, if the general did sail to America rather than lie in state, he would arrive not as a conquering hero, but as a gentle, harmless, nameless, scholarly old man who spent most of his time reading. And during the course of his stay, inevitably, someone would observe his subtle power over great patriots and write about it. Just such a person was observed and written about. During the fall of 1775, Congress authorized a committee made up of Benjamin Franklin, Thomas Lynch, Benjamin Harrison, and George Washington to consider and recommend a design for the first united colonial flag. The so-called quote-unquote Flag Committee traveled to Cambridge in Massachusetts. There, according to the only known account of its proceedings given in Robert Allen Campbell's book Our Flag, published in Chicago in 1890, the committee mysteriously shared its authority with a total stranger. This stranger was an elderly European transient, known only as quote-unquote the Professor. Remember, I told you in earlier chapters of the Professor already. He had arrived from parts unknown at summer's end. The prisoner of Castle St. Angelo had not been publicly seen in 2 years. Ample time to manage Brashi's election to the papacy, relax, pack important things, die the philosopher's death, and take a 3-month voyage to Boston Harbor. Since his arrival, the professor had occupied a guest room in a private Cambridge home, whose hostess, quote, "one of his earnest and intelligent disciples," unquote, would remember him in her diary, as cited in Campbell's book, as, quote, "a quiet and very interesting member of the family," unquote. What the hostess records about the professor matches remarkably what is known about the character of Lorenzo Ricci. For example, the professor is perceived to be, quote, "more than 70 years of age," unquote. Lorenzo Ricci was 72. The professor spoke many languages fluently, displayed an encyclopedic knowledge of history, and was, quote, "seemingly at home seemingly at home upon any and every topic coming up in conversation," unquote. We might expect the very same of Lorenzo Ricci, a distinguished professor of literature, philosophy, and theology at the Roman College, and a well-established confidant of Europe's leading intellectuals, philosophes, and mystics. The professor kept, quote, "locked away in a large, old-fashioned, cubically shaped, iron-bound, heavy oaken chest a number of very rare old books and ancient manuscripts," unquote, which he spent much of his time, quote, "deciphering, translating, or rewriting," unquote. We might expect as much of Lorenzo Ricci, the voracious scholar and publisher of Oriental masterworks. On the morning of December 13, 1775, the committeemen arrived in Cambridge for a midday feast. The professor greeted them, as we might expect Lorenzo Ricci would, quote, "with an ease, grace, and dignity evidencing his superior ability, experience and attainments, and, with a courtly bow that left no room to doubt that he had habitually associated with those in acknowledged authority." Unquote. When Benjamin Franklin was presented to him, the hostess watched the patriarchal doctor lock hands with the patriarchal professor, quote, "and as fingers closed upon fingers, their eyes also met, and there was an instantaneous, a very apparent, and a mutual gratified recognition." Unquote. What had the woman witnessed? The ultimate summit? Unknown superior revealing himself to America's grandest Freemason? Remember who is on the top of Freemasonry. The table talk soon focused on subjects that had occupied Lorenzo Ricci's attention since the beginning of his generalate. The hostess witnessed them discussing, quote, "the relation of the colonies to each other and to the mother country." Unquote. She saw them discuss, quote, "the related question of one's duty to the colony as related to his allegiance to Great Britain." Unquote. She saw the professor take, quote, "a noticeable, though not at all an obtrusive part in the conversation, himself possessed of a wonderful fund of varied and accurate information concerning the colonies, an understanding of their progress, condition, and needs, and a familiarity with the principles and operations of British and European statesmanship." Unquote. Now, wouldn't we expect as much from the Superior General of the world's best intelligence agency? After lunch, General Washington and the committeemen held a, quote, "brief undertoned conversation." Unquote. Then Dr. Franklin rose and stated, quote, "As the chairman of this committee, speaking for my associates, with their consent and with the approval of General Washington, I respectfully invite the professor to meet with the committee as one of its members, and we each one personally and urgently request him to accept the responsibility and to give us and the American colonies the benefit of his counsel." Unquote. Taking the floor, the professor accepted the responsibility. Then, startlingly, he proposed that his disciple, the hostess, be placed on the committee, quote, "because she's our hostess, because she's a woman, and above all, because she is a superior woman." Unquote. Now, the committee considered this an innovation, yet the Jesuits had been employing female coadjutors for centuries. The proposal was, quote, "immediately and unanimously adopted." Unquote. Luncheon was adjourned. The committee would reconvene at 7 in the evening in the guest chamber usually occupied by the professor. Franklin and the professor spent the afternoon together walking about Cambridge. When they returned, the hostess noted that, quote, "both of them wore the relieved and confident look of earnest and determined men who had, in a satisfactory way, solved a perplexing problem, and of victors who had successfully mastered a difficult and dangerous situation." Unquote. At the evening session, Franklin turned the meeting over to, quote, "his newfound and abundantly honored friend." Unquote. The subject was a flag. Addressing the committee as, quote, "Comrade Americans," unquote, the professor explained that, since the colonies were still dependent upon Great Britain, quote, "we are not expected to design or recommend a flag which will represent a new government or an independent nation," unquote, but instead one that, quote, "that will testify our present loyalty as English subjects," unquote, a flag that was, quote unquote, "already in use," a flag that had been recognized by the British government for, quote unquote, half a century, a flag having a field of alternate horizontal red and white stripes with the Grand Union flag of Great Britain in the upper left corner. I refer, he said, to the flag of the East India Company. To hide the fact that Americans would be fighting under the private flag of an international mercantile corporation controlled by Jesuits, the professor provided a plausible cover whereby the flag could be explained to the masses. Now, make sure that you listen very well, because I will also do a comment right after this, reading this last paragraph on page 192 in the book. This is a prime example of esoteric and exoteric knowledge. To hide the fact that Americans would be fighting under the private flag of an international mercantile corporation controlled by Jesuits, the professor provided a plausible cover whereby the flag could be, quote-unquote, explained to the masses. This is what we call exoteric knowledge. That is what the masses shall believe, and then you have an esoteric knowledge. That is what the insiders know. They not only believe it, they also know it. Quote, "The Union flag of the mother country is retained as the Union, on the upper left corner, of our new flag to announce that the colonies are loyal to the just and legitimate sovereignty of the British government. The 13 stripes will at once be understood to represent the 13 colonies. Their equal width will type the equal rank, rights and responsibilities of the colonies. The union of the stripes in the field of our flag will announce the unity of interests and the cooperative union of efforts which the colonies recognize and put forth in their common cause. The white stripes will signify that we consider our demands just and reasonable, and that we will seek to secure our rights through peaceable, intelligent, and statesmanlike means, if they prove at all possible. And the red stripes at the top and bottom of our flag will declare that first and last, and always, we have the determination, the enthusiasm, and the power to use force whenever we deem force necessary. The alternation of the red and white stripes will suggest that our reasons for all demands will be intelligent and forcible, and that our force in securing our rights will be just and reasonable." Now, I have to make a little comment on this. What he doesn't tell you here is that the "we" referred to in the text, when he reads, for example, "We have the determination, enthusiasm, and the power to use force whenever we deem force necessary." What he doesn't tell you is that the "we" referred to in the text means, and that is the esoteric knowledge, refers to the Roman Catholic Church and the Jesuit order. This is esoteric knowledge. Do you remember the sentence above I read, at the bottom of page 191? I'm going to read it again. "Franklin and the professor spent the afternoon together walking about Cambridge. When they returned, the hostess noted that, quote, both of them wore the relieved and confident look of earnest and determined men who had, in a satisfactory way, solved a perplexing problem, and of victors who had successfully mastered a difficult and dangerous situation." Unquote. That's on the bottom of the page before, And then they come to this flag committee, and he tells us about the so-called exoteric knowledge, the meaning, the plausible, that can be explained to the masses. To me, it is very clear that Franklin knew who the professor was, and that he knew of the Vatican Jesuit scheme to found the quote-unquote United States of America, and that he was informed of the esoteric knowledge as well as the exoteric knowledge, as well as of the flag, as of the new nation to be found. The author continues, The professor reminded the committee that the masses of the people and a large majority of the leaders of public opinion desire a removal of grievances and a rectification of wrongs through a fuller recognition of their rights as British subjects, and few of them desire, a very few of them expect, at this time, any complete severance of their present political and dependent relations with the British government. That severance would occur, quote, before the sun in its next summer strength, unquote, indicating that the professor foreknew, as Lorenzo Ricci would have foreknown, a July declaration of independence. At that time, the East India Company flag would be, quote unquote, easily modified by replacing the Union Jack with stars against a blue background, quote, to make it announce and represent the new and independent nation, unquote. Washington and Franklin lavished the professor's idea with, quote, especial approval and unstinted praise, unquote. The committee formally and unanimously adopted the East India Company's banner, known as, quote unquote, the 13 Stripes, as the, quote, general flag and recognized standard of the colonial army and navy, unquote. Just before midnight, they adjourned. On January 2, 1776, at a formal ceremony attended by the Flag Committee, George Washington personally hoisted the East India Company flag, quote, upon a towering and specially raised pine tree liberty pole, unquote, unfurling it to the breeze and displaying it for the first time, quote, to his army, the citizens of the vicinity, and the British forces in Boston, unquote. The British officers at Charlestown Heights perceived the event, quote, to mean that General Washington had thus announced his surrender to them. At once they saluted, quote unquote, the 13 Stripes, with 13 happy cheers. They immediately followed his spontaneous outburst of British enthusiasm with the grander and more dignified official salute of 13 guns, the 13-gun salute being the highest compliment in gunpowder, the military, quote unquote, Godspeed you, unquote. By so colorfully equivocating both his enemies, the professor had made himself god of confusion. The redcoats were toasting the good health of the rebels, who in turn were fighting for the East India Company. One of the few places in the world where such ludicrous phenomena are considered standard and routine is in the pages of Lorenzo Ricci's 13 articles. Quote, the general decides everything. He knows how to shape at will not only the army he is commanding, but also that of his enemies, unquote. Lorenzo Ricci's post-mortem attendance in America is strongly suggested in yet another pivotal episode, the famous quote-unquote mission to Canada. This strange exercise is normally regarded by historians as a colossal failure. It began on February 15, 1776, when the Second Continental Congress resolved to send Benjamin Franklin, Samuel Chase, and Charles Carroll, you know, the Jesuit in Europe educated later first citizen, to Montreal with full authority, quote, to promote or form a union, unquote, with Canada against England. Now this is really interesting, so pay attention please. Just before the committee left Philadelphia, John Adams proposed a curious last-minute resolution. On the record, he requested, quote, that Charles Carroll prevail on Mr. John Carroll to accompany the committee to Canada to assist them in such matters as they shall think useful, unquote. Congress adopted the resolution. How might a priest have assisted the committee in promoting or forming a union with Canada? Well, we are speaking about John Carroll, the later first bishop, Catholic bishop in the United States of America. How could he, that priest, have assisted the committee in promoting or forming a union with Canada? The answer lies in demographics. Canada then was largely Quebec, and Quebec, though ruled despotically by the British since 1763, was mostly Roman Catholic. A Jesuit priest, armed with the right Vatican paperwork or password, could exert powerful influence on Canadian foreign policy. The same priest, if accompanied by the combined head of the Black Papacy and International Freemasonry, could make that policy. The mission arrived in Montreal only to learn that Bishop Bryant of Quebec had ordered Pierre Floquet, the Jesuit superior in Montreal, to consider John Carroll persona non grata, means a person that is not welcomed. Floquet, however, defied his bishop and invited Carroll to say Mass in his home anyway, for which Floquet was immediately suspended from his priestly functions. The incident colored the mission with disaster, although Floquet was restored according to Walsh's American Jesuit book after a simple apology. Disaster was verified when the committee returned to Philadelphia with no prospect for any union whatsoever with Canada. Congress lamented that America's first diplomatic legation had failed, but, listen, but America's first diplomatic legation was San Juan and Jesuitic diplomacy can be expected to conceal victory behind mishap. As the 13 Articles put it, quote, "You must have a real advantage when the enemy believes you have sustained some losses," unquote. So we examine the Canadian mishap for a real advantage and discover something far more valuable than the originally sought union. While Bishop Bryant was outwardly demeaning John Carroll, the mission was obtaining from Canada a position of neutrality. This was a significant achievement considering Canada's good relationship with Great Britain on the one hand, and 2 centuries of hostilities toward New England on the other. For the colonists, Canadian neutrality removed the threat of a powerful northwestern enemy and cleared the way for a declaration of independence. At Montreal, as at Cambridge, I sensed the presence of someone infinitely more commanding than mere committeemen appointed by Congress. I sensed the presence of the honorary committeeman unlisted in any record, the professor, the fugitive vicar of Christ. Returning from Canada, Benjamin Franklin fell ill. It was John Carroll who escorted him to Philadelphia. At Franklin's invitation, Carroll moved into his home. Franklin acknowledged the fact in a letter dated on May 27, 1776, mentioning, quote, "Mr. Carroll's friendly assistance and tender care for me," unquote. These were critical weeks of countdown to the Declaration of Independence. I wonder who else might have been found under the Franklin roof. Perhaps the professor with his dynamic oaken chest? Philadelphia was crawling just now with social activities from all over. The very people Lorenzo Ricci had appointed John Carroll as prefect of the sodality to organize. The home of America's preeminent Freemason, with Carroll and perhaps even Ricci in residence, would have become the main clearinghouse for sub-rosa congressional business. On July 3, 1776, John Adams took pen in hand and dashed off a letter to his wife Abigail. Adams was a writer of Mozartian facility, concentration and confidence. Everything he ever wrote was first draft and good. He never struck through words, never edited. His moving hand, having writ, just moved on. Quote, "Yesterday," unquote, he scribbled. Quote, "The greatest question was decided which ever was debated in America, and the greater perhaps never was nor will be decided among men. A resolution was passed without one dissenting colony that these united colonies are, and of right ought to have, full power to make war, conclude peace, establish commerce, and to do all other acts and things which other states may rightfully do. the second day of July 1776 will be the most memorable day in the history of America. I am apt to believe that it will be celebrated by succeeding generations as the great anniversary festival. It ought to be commemorated as the day of deliverance by solemn acts of devotion to God Almighty. It ought to be solemnized with pomp and parade, with shows, games, sports, guns, bells, bonfires, and illuminations, from one end of this continent to the other, from this time forward, forevermore." Unquote. Shall I read it again? It ought to be solemnized with pomp and parade, with shows, games, sports, guns, bells, bonfires, and illuminations, from one end of this continent to the other, from this time forward, forevermore. This sounds all very pagan to me. And today you don't have that on the 2nd of July, you have that on the 4th of July, but the idea is the same that John Adams wrote about on his letter. Continue reading. If the Black Papacy truly had orchestrated America's breakaway from England, we would expect to find the 2nd day of July to be rich in Kabbalah and in Roman Catholic liturgical color. The liturgical calendar is a process authorized nowhere in the Bible through which faithful Catholics may plead with Almighty God for favors through the merits of ascended saints on special feast days. Supposedly, the prayerful performance of an act on a date the Church has consecrated to a saint endows the act with the mystic of the saint as well as the saint's intercessory prayer to God for success. Maryland history, for example, is grounded in the liturgical calendar. We recall how the original settlers of Maryland, many of whom were Roman Catholics, set sail from England under the spiritual direction of Jesuit Father Andrew White on November 22nd, 1633. November 22nd is the feast day of Saint Cecilia, a 3rd century Roman martyr and traditional patroness of musicians. By the way, it's also the day that John F. Kennedy got shot, right? And 22nd of November, 22 and 11 gives 33. Okay, I continue reading the book. I think Tupper Saussy has more than enough Kabbalah for all of us than I have with my little brain here. November 22nd is the feast day of Saint Cecilia, a 3rd century Roman martyr and traditional patroness of musicians. Did Cecilia's spirit bless the voyage with musicality to cheer up another otherwise oppressive boredom? The voyagers reached landfall the following year on March 25th, Annunciation Day, feast of the angel Gabriel's announcement to the Virgin Mary that she is pregnant with the Son of God. Annunciation Day contains the joyful mystery of an angel's announcing the planting of the divine seed within a virgin matrix. Did the settlers imagine themselves planting the seed of a new social order in a strange wilderness, the whole enterprise blessed by God through the merits of the Virgin Mary's unique relationship to Him? Then, exactly 1 year later, on Annunciation Day of 1634, Father White consecrated the colony of Maryland to the Virgin Mary. The 2nd day of July in the year 1776 was Visitation Day, commemorating the event recorded in the 1st chapter of Luke, wherein the Virgin, pregnant with the Messiah, visits her cousin Elizabeth, who is pregnant with John the Baptist. Little note, nowadays Visitation Day is celebrated on May 31st, but in the year 1776 it was celebrated on July 2nd. As it had been celebrated according to the New Catholic Encyclopedia's article entitled quote-unquote Visitation of Mary every year since the Council of Basel in 1441. End of the note from the author. No day in the liturgical calendar is more suited to Bellarminian liberation theology than Visitation Day. Sainte Marguerite Marie Alacoque whose visions inspired the Jesuit social action cult of Sacred Heart, which I was talking about, you remember in the Generalate chart, other video, was a member of the Visitandines, an order of nuns devoted to the Visitation. Visitation Day scriptural basis is the Virgin Mary's ecstatic sermon to Elizabeth at Luke 1:46 through 53. This famous ejaculation, known as the Magnificat, the opening word in the Latin Vulgate's rendering of the passage meaning "it magnifies," literally defines the social action called for by Sacred Heart in Philadelphia on the 2nd day of July, 1776. Quote, "My soul doth magnify the Lord, and my spirit hath rejoiced in God my Saviour. For he hath regarded the low estate of his handmaiden. For, behold, from henceforth all generations shall call me blessed. For he that is mighty hath done to me great things, and holy is his name. And his mercy is on them that fear him from generation to generation. He hath shewed strength with his arm. He hath scattered the proud in the imagination of their hearts. He hath put down the mighty from their seats, and exalted them of low degree. He hath filled the hungry with good things, and the rich he hath sent away empty." Unquote. Scattered the proud, put down the mighty, exalted them of low degree, and filled the hungry, emptied the rich. This is the rhetoric of Christian redemption, yes, but in the context of Lorenzo Ricci's agenda, it's the rhetoric of rebellion to tyranny, the very point of the Declaration of Independence, and it's spoken by the Virgin Mary, patroness of the Society of Jesus, patroness of Maryland, indeed, patroness of the Roman Catholic conquest, on the day particular to her. Let me just insert Virgin Mary and blah 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 blah. Don't forget, that is the Queen of Heaven. That is Semiramis, Cybele, Diana, Astarte, whatever you want to call her. She is a pagan goddess. And of course all the Kabbalah has nothing to do with Bible. Please understand that. But I think the author should have a little bit put more the emphasis when writing about the Virgin Mary, quote-unquote Virgin Mary, because she wasn't a virgin when she died. And for that, go to chapter 3 of Babylon Mystery Religion, the reading I do there, to understand that, and read the Bible for yourselves, because she begot children with Joseph after Jesus was born. I think Tupper Saussy should have made a little bit more emphasis on this, but okay, his emphasis was not on the Bible, but more on the Jesuits' evil doing here. And I understand that. It's no critique, but it's just to make a little bit a different point that he made here. Even the year of independence seems divinely validated by the perfect design of sixes and sevens contained within this expression in Roman numerals. Because in Roman numerals you write 1776 as follows: MDCCLXXVI. Now, when we break that down, we will write MDC. That stands for 1500 and 100, meaning 1600. 1 plus 6 equals 7. CLX stands for 100, 50, and 10. 160, 1 plus 6 equals 7. And XVI stands for 10, 5, and 1, 16, 1 plus 6 equals 7. Particularly fascinating is the way the Latin equivalent of 1776 is structured upon 666 and 777. Swiss theologian E.W. Ballinger, in his scholarly guide to biblical biblical arithmography, number in scripture, says that 6 in the Bible is always associated with humanity. You know, the number of the number 666 is the number of a man. Okay, 7 is associated with divinity. The two numbers total 13, which Bollinger says is biblically associated with rebellion. MDCCL-XXVI 1776 really does seem to be a unique convergence of time and human rebellion in the service of a divine ordination. This is eerily corroborated by John Adams' letter to Abigail on July the 3rd. He confides to his wife that independence should have been declared in December of 1775. Quote, "Had the Declaration of Independence been made 7 months ago, it would have been attended with many great and glorious effects. If I could write with freedom," remember this sentence that John Adams writes to his wife Abigail here. "If I could write with freedom," very important, coming up later, "I could easily convince you that it would, and explain it to you, the matter how." Unquote. Adams never fully explained how the earlier declaration would have produced that great and glorious effects. However, the numbers suggest it would have rather fizzled. Roman numerals for 1775 fall in the following groups. MDC, standing like in the other one, for 1600, 1 plus 6, 1 plus 6 equals 7. CLX, again 160, 1 plus 6 equals 7. And XV, 15, 1 plus 5 is 6, leads up to 776 instead of before in 1776, 777. Plain to see, December 1775 fails as Kabbalah. It gives no indication of divine approval to rebellious humanity. This is why I believe Lorenzo Ricci held out for 1776. Of course, a sufficiently Gnostic Jesuit would see in MDCCLXXVI more than good numbers. He would see an encapsulation of the very origins of the Society of Jesus. MDC, remember 1600, would give him Milice du Christ, Christian militia, the official classification of the Knights Templar and the Society of Jesus. MDC also produces Medici, the family name of Pope Leo X, whose degeneracy provoked Martin Luther to create the Protestant movement, which in turn created the need for the Society of Jesus. CLX 160 specifies the Ignatian era, which historians have ever since called, quote, "the century of Leo X," unquote. And the last three numerals name the century of Leo X, the 16th century, XVI. When it came time to sign the Declaration of Independence, how could Lorenzo Ricci not be present? How could he, who had labored more than 17 years for this superbly Bellarminian ambience, not participate in the excitement? There is a story, usually told in conjunction with the professor and the flag committee, involving another mysterious stranger, one who suddenly appeared in the legislative chamber of the old State House in Philadelphia on the night of July 4th. The moment was tense. Independence had been resolved, but the document lacked signatures. Some were having second thoughts about the risks. Masonic historian Manly P. Hall writes, quote, "It was a grave moment, and not a few of those present feared that their lives would be in the forfeit for their audacity. In the midst of the debate a fierce voice rang out. The debaters stopped and turned to look upon the stranger. Who was this man who had suddenly appeared in their midst and transfixed them with this oratory? They had never seen him before. None knew when he had entered, but his tall form and pale face filled them with awe. His voice ringing with a holy zeal, the stranger stirred them to their very souls. His closing words rang through the building. 'God has given America to be free!' As the stranger sank into a chair exhausted, a wild enthusiasm burst forth. Name after name was placed upon the parchment. The Declaration of Independence was signed. But where was the man who had precipitated and accomplishment of this immortal task? Who had lifted for a moment the veil from the eyes of the assemblage and revealed to them the part at least of the great purpose for which the new nation was conceived? He had disappeared, nor was he ever seen again, or his identity established. Unquote. Be warned. This is only a story, unsupported by primary source material. John Adams, the most talkative of the framers, said not a word about it. But we know from Adams' own pen that some kind of gag order had been imposed upon the signers, quote, "if I could write with freedom," unquote. He had told Abigail in that letter dated the 3rd of July. Could Manly P. Hall have received the story through Freemasonry's well-insulated oral tradition? Could the stranger whose voice rang quote-unquote with a holy zeal have been the professor, Lorenzo Ricci? Could the quote-unquote wild enthusiasm with which the legislator signed the Declaration have resulted not from Ricci's inspiring pep talk, but upon his disclosure of documents taken from the oaken chest, documents easy for the Vicar of Christ in his capacity as Freemasonry's unknown superior to obtain, guaranteeing that the international monetary network would indemnify the signers for their action? My mind, informed by an ever-increasing knowledge of how the greatest clandestine warriors fight, has no problem whatsoever believing this to be the case. It is exquisitely consistent with the formation of a Febronian union of 13 Protestant colonies, ordained to be ruled from a federal city named Rome, a city situated within the See of Baltimore, under the protection of the patroness of the Society of Jesus. One of the more intriguing clues that the United States of America was established under regimini militantis ecclesiae, the church militant, is the new republic's Great Seal. As we shall see in the next chapter, the seal is legal proof that America's true founding fathers were indeed priests of Rome. And this ends the reading of chapter 19. Few days ago, yesterday, I made the reading and the video of Lorenzo Ricci's journalite and this little chart that I was explaining there for 33 minutes, and now 57 minutes of the reading of this chapter. So you see, chapter 19 goes altogether for an hour and a half, means that it's probably quite important. Except, of course, if you think this is all just gibberish, Shakespearean gibberish, like I know someone who calls the King James Bible that. Okay, shouldn't go into that here. I think you see, every chapter gets more and more important, and you will see when we come to chapter 21, 22, 23, this was all just a warming up. Chapter 20 is called American Gravity, but I will give you some time to digest chapter 19 that I've just read to you, and maybe go back into the archives and listen to the one or the other a little bit more. And finally, I want to remind you to go to First Amendment Radio and listen to Greg Anthony, is he called now, Greg Anthony's investigative journal, 4th and 5th of November, or 5th and 6th. I put the link in the description box also of this video, so click on that and you can look to the videos and you can listen to a real, authentic interview that Greg Anthony did in 2006 with Tupper Saussy while he was still alive. And listen to the author himself and explaining a few things about this book and about his way of thinking that I totally agree with. Okay, I hope you enjoyed it. I did very much anyway, and I'm looking forward to the next chapter, chapter 20, American Graffiti of Rulers of Evil. Until then, I wish you all well. God bless you and bye-bye. So, actually the video was done at this point, but then I stumbled upon something that I couldn't withhold of you. That is a lecture from Walter Veit called From Crete to Malta. It's a series of, I don't know, 5, 6 lectures that he did. And there, for all the first time that I've seen Walter Veit, these are very new lectures, he goes into the reading of H.Tupper Saussy's Rulers of Evil and mentions a lot of this book. And he made a few things clear that I saw already, and you know that when you listen to my comments and everything. But you know, seeing this and expressing it in the same way is something else. I didn't express it that way, but the point being, and I will let Walter Veit let speak for himself, because I will put a few minutes audio at the end of the recording of this here. The point being is that the deception is so big, and you have to understand that, of course, Satan knows the Bible and God's plans all and for it. And when the reformers all identified the first beast of Revelation 13 as being the papacy, without any doubt, they also could have probably, when they knew the prophecy of the 1260 years, foresee that America would be the second beast. Maybe not at their time, maybe not all the studies in that, but they knew that the Protestants who were following all the Protestant reformers, all the reformers at that time, could get to that clue. So the whole scheme was from the beginning, and that is the important role that Lorenzo Ricci played in this succession of black popes. The scheme was from the beginning to make sure that when they found the United States of America, the second beast of Revelation 13, they make sure that the Jesuits could never be expelled from that country as they got expelled from all the other countries. And therefore, first and for all, it was important to just make the Jesuit order disappear. When they are not there anymore, they are not a threat, right? So what happened in 1773 when the Pope banished the Jesuit order, so-called worldwide, so-called forever? The Jesuits disappeared. They were no threat anymore. And a few years later, 1798, General Berthier went to the Vatican, took the Pope captive, and then the Pope was no threat anymore because he was taken off his civil power. So now the Jesuits were gone, and the papacy was gone, and the people had nothing to fear anymore. And then came, first of all, the teaching of futurism. And by that, putting all the Protestants during the next few centuries in total sleep, they do not know today anymore who their enemy is. I think you will enjoy this. I think it's a 5 or 6 minute little audio from Walter Veit now at the end, explaining it maybe a little bit better in a little bit better words than I can do. But here you really have to see the deception. Not only we know the Bible, we are blessed that we know it because of the reformers. They gave it to us, and the committee of King James in between 1604 and 1611 translated the Word of God, and it is kept for us still today. We are very, very grateful for that on the one hand, but on the other hand you also have to understand that Satan, and so by that his minions, also know the Bible and know how to react. And the last thing that I wanted to put in there, it was a thought that already crossed my mind a long time, that was that this Sun Tzu that we were speaking about and the art of war, you don't have to forget that that book was written by a Jesuit. Very convenient and popping up at the time of Lorenzo Ricci's Generate. Very important. My thought was all the time already that that was a book written by the Jesuits. And by that, of course, explaining their theory of the war. And Walter Veit goes into that also in his lecture From Crete to Malta. He believes also that Sun Tzu is more a fictitious person, and especially that Chinese king that it was all about. But anyway, I'm gonna leave you now with the thoughts that I've just expressed to myself, and think about that when you next read the Bible, and certainly when you read Revelation 13, and when you're still in disagreement with me that the second beast of the Revelation 13 is the United States of America. I think then you haven't even understood one word that was read in all the chapters of the book of Rulers of Evil that I've read to you, and especially you don't have any understanding of the Bible. But anyway, I'm finishing off here, and I leave the floor for Walter Veit to close up in a few minutes, and he gives you his point of view of these events. It was a very long episode of Rulers of Evil, but make sure that you will not miss chapter 20, because when I read that yesterday, I almost fell from my chair. And I was bumping on the table, and I thought all the time the things that H.Tupper Saussy said in his interview. Are you kidding me? Is that true? Are you kidding me now? Yeah, it's so blunt in our face. It gets very, very interesting the next chapters, I can assure you. But okay, here's to Walter Veit, and hope to see you next time. Until then, God bless you and bye-bye.
Did you know that this book is compulsory reading for the military in this country? Now, with this knowledge in our minds, and we're thinking about the year 1798, the period leading up to it, and the period following. Now, does the devil know the Bible, yes or no? Yes. Okay. If Wesley could figure out that the first beast of Revelation 13 was the papacy, if Martin Luther could figure that out, if Melanchthon could figure that out, if Cranmer could figure that out, if Ridley could figure that out, then surely the devil had it figured out long before them, right? And if Wesley could figure out that the second beast of Revelation chapter 13 was about to appear because it was the end of the 1,260-day period, then surely the devil knows that too. Because he knows God's plan, and his plan is to subvert. So if he knows this is going to happen, is he going to try to be in the field first? Yes or no? Because he wins, who is there? First. Now the Bible tells us that the second beast will deceive the whole world by making fire come down from heaven, deceiving all the people. And this fire cannot be literal fire, because literal fire is anything but deception. It just kills people. Deception must be something else. So this is a form of religion that will emanate eventually out of this chaos, which will enable the first beast to make the second beast do its bidding. So in other words, it must be able to pull the strings in order to do that. So the first thing you do is, what's the problem with the upcoming nation? Well, it's a Protestant nation. It's a Protestant nation. And the upcoming nation is subject to the King of England and the British Parliament, which had banned the Jesuits and Catholicism out of the realm under pain of death. So we have to avoid that. We have to avoid a nation adopting a constitution as the British have, because that would ban Catholicism and expose it for what it is. So we need something else. We need a constitutional system which will guarantee that the Jesuits can never be thrown out. A constitution which lays no claim on religious convictions. That must include them. So that's the first point. Okay. Then what do you do with the Protestants? Well, you divide them up. You infiltrate them. And you create hundreds and eventually thousands and then tens of thousands of denominations, and you pull the strings between all of them, and you make them argue with each other, and you feed them your theology in various forms, so that there are so many theologies, you don't know who's who in this zoo. And then eventually, you get them all so riled up about the situation which you create in the first place, that they will want to legislate their morality, but the morality must be the morality of the first beast. Does this sound logical? Okay. But the Protestants are weary. The Protestants have a problem. The Protestants know that the Jesuits were there to counter the Reformation. And it's written in all the writings of the Reformers. And all the theologians of the Lutheran Church were exposing the Jesuits as the greatest danger to biblical theology. And the Queen of England had told them, if I ever see you in this country, you're dead. You're not allowed to put your foot in this country. You're banned. And the Jesuit plot to blow up the Parliament had been exposed, and the 6 Jesuits associated with Guy Fawkes were all hung. They were all executed. So how do you get rid of this mindset that the Jesuits are a problem? What's the best thing to do? Disappear. No longer exist. And the same for the Roman Catholic system. If it doesn't exist as a political entity that can command one king to do this and another king to do that at his bidding, well, then get rid of it. Get rid of his political power. The Bible says, and one of his heads seemed to have a mortal wound. It doesn't say one of its heads had a mortal wound. It says one of the heads seemed to have a mortal wound. And we know what the date is, 1798, when Napoleon's general marches in and arrests the Pope and takes him away in exile. An aging Pope was already sick, by the way. And the political power of the papacy ends. But that's no use if the Protestants know that the real power behind the throne is the Jesuit general. So you have to get rid of him too. General Ricci, what plans are you going to make the enemy think that you're a pushover and no longer exist? Are you just going to disappear? The Society of Jesus could conquer, though believed dead.